and welcome to my channel. It seems to be a rite of passage among Christian channels on YouTube to make a video or video series on proofs for the existence of God, so I decided to take a stab at it. In this video, I'm going to give 3 proofs for the existence of a necessary substance. In part 2, I will prove that this necessary entity is uncaused and is unique in being uncaused, and therefore it must be the uncaused cause of everything else in the universe. In part 3, I will prove that it is immaterial and rational, and in part 4, I will prove that this necessary substance must be triune. That is, the substance exists as 3 co-eternal persons participating in one substance. In this video, I will consider 3 arguments for the existence of a necessary substance, one from Thomas Aquinas, one of my own, and one posited by Dr. Chad Vance of the College of William and Mary. So let's begin. By necessary substance, what I mean is that I'm going to prove that there is a thing such that it must exist. That is to say, this entity was not caused to exist by something else, but exists in its own right. It exists in every possible universe, and this entity did not come into being in any moment in time, but has always existed and will always exist. Argument 1. The de Ente argument of Thomas Aquinas. The de Ente argument of Thomas Aquinas is presented in his book On Being and Essence. To understand the argument, we're going to have to understand the difference between being and essence. Consider the device you're watching this video on. That device actually exists, that is to say, it has being. Out of infinitely millions of computers or phones that might have existed but didn't, and the computers or phones that might at one point exist but don't yet, yours does. In fact, you can probably imagine a computer or phone exactly like yours, made from different pieces of plastic and other materials, but in design completely alike to yours, except that it doesn't exist. It doesn't have being. Now consider your pet. Or if you don't have a pet, consider someone else's pet. If you don't know anyone with a pet, go outside, find the nearest animal, and acknowledge its existence and come back. Now, whatever animal you are thinking about right now, like your computer, it also exists. Your computer and that animal have that in common, despite having very little else in common. One is a machine made by man, the other is a living creature who was born. One is made of plastic, one is made of cells. One works better if it's plugged into an electrical outlet, the other doesn't. So on and so forth. I won't belabor the point. The key thing here is all these differences between existing things must be explained by something other than existence, because your animal and computer both exist. Now you might say, well, that's easy. They're just different kinds of things, which is exactly the point. So what is it that makes a particular thing a member of one kind and not of another? The word Thomas used for it was essence. Now, if things that exist have both essence and existence, we should consider the relationship between them, by which I mean, does the fact that something exists make it a computer or a cat or something else? Obviously not. We know this because there are lots of things that exist that aren't computers or cats. Thus, the fact that something exists doesn't tell us how it exists. Okay, let's try it the reverse way. Does a thing's essence give it existence? In other words, given that something is a dog, does that mean that dog exists? This doesn't seem likely either. After all, Clifford from the book series Clifford the Big Red Dog is in fact a dog. However, Clifford does not exist. This seems to create a problem. If a thing's essence doesn't determine its existence, then what does? Clearly, it must receive it from something else. Cool. So something else exists which gives the thing we're considering its existence. But now we have to explain why that thing exists. And if we say that it receives its existence from another thing, then we have to explain where that thing got its existence, so on and so forth. This is the start of an infinite regress. So what would be the termination? Well, if there is a thing that's essence is its own existence, that is, if there is a thing that the way in which it exists or how it exists is that it exists, that would be it. Cool, so let's say we have one of those. What does that mean? Well, it means that thing must exist because the kind of thing it is that it exists. So, that must mean it exists necessarily. Therefore, a necessary substance exists. Argument 2. The brute force argument from the impossibility of nothing. So the previous argument works, but can we prove it another way? Sure. Let's consider what exists in every possible world. Now, by possible world, I don't mean something weird like alternate realities or universes, but simply what are the possible different ways our own universe could be constituted. For example, it is theoretically possible that instead of Donald Trump winning the 2016 election, Hillary Clinton would have won. Thus, we could posit the existence of a possible world where Hillary Clinton won the 2016 election. If a necessary entity exists, then it should follow that it exists in every single one of these universes. Now, as I said in a previous video, the world is very big. So considering everything that exists is going to be difficult. But how much more difficult would it be to consider everything that exists in every possible world? But there is an easier way. If a necessary entity must exist in every possible world, then it must exist in the smallest possible world as well. So we only have to consider the smallest possible worlds. Now, the smallest candidate for a possible world would be a world with 0 things in it. But is it truly possible for nothing to exist? It might seem like it is. After all, we just have to imagine a world exactly like ours and simply remove things systematically until there is nothing left. But there are a couple significant problems that we would have to overcome. In fact, our language demonstrates this problem. To say nothing exists or until nothing is left treats nothing as a noun, and nouns are things, not nothing. To create a world in which nothing exists runs across a contradiction in treating nothingness in the same way we treat something. Think about donuts. A donut is a pastry with a hole in the middle. Some donuts have bigger holes, some have smaller holes. If I were to remove more pastry from around the hole in the center, I still have a donut. But if I were to remove all the pastry, not only do I not have a donut, but I don't have a donut hole anymore. What does this tell us? An absence or nothingness is only relative to that which the absence is in. An absence cannot exist by itself. Thus, a possible world with nothing in it can't exist, because nothing is an absence of something, and therefore only makes sense relative to something. Now, if you're a reader of Immanuel Kant or Bertrand Russell, you might say, well, the problem is that you're treating existence like a quality. To say something is or isn't is not the same as saying that something is red or big or furry. Existence isn't a predicate. Thus, you might suggest that instead of saying nothing exists, we should say something like, there is nothing. Fine. But that doesn't fix the problem, because when you say there is nothing, you're presupposing the existence of something which there refers to. That is still something and not nothing. Therefore, nothing still can't exist. To show it another way, possible worlds must be possibilities of each other, meaning it has to be a two-way street. For example, if it is the case that Hillary Clinton might have won the 2016 election, then we should be able to imagine such a world where Hillary Clinton did win the 2016 election, and from the perspective of that world, say that there is a possible world where Trump won the election. But, even supposing that we can imagine that a world with nothing in it is a possibility of our world, we could not say that our world is a possibility of a world with nothing in it, because it's clear that from nothing, nothing comes. A world with nothing has no possibility, and therefore, a world with nothing in it could never have our world as a possibility. Therefore, it's impossible for nothing to exist. So a world with 0 things in it is impossible. But how about a world with 1 thing in it? What is it? I don't know. Take your pick. It could be a black hole, a star, a cat, a cheeseburger, a unicorn, or a single electron. It really doesn't matter. Now, whatever that thing is that a necessary or a contingent entity? Does it exist necessarily or contingently upon something else? If it is necessary, then we have found our necessary entity. But what if it's contingent? Well, what exactly is it contingent on? It can't be contingent on itself, or else it would be a necessary entity, so it must be contingent upon something else in the universe. But there is nothing else in the universe. Furthermore, if that entity were contingent, that means it could possibly not exist. Given an infinite timeline, a contingent entity would at some point not exist unless dependent on a necessary entity. That there would necessarily be a time in this universe where nothing exists, but nothing cannot exist for the reason we gave above. Therefore, the only possible world that could exist with one entity is one with a necessary entity. Thus, we have found our necessary entity. You guys probably see where this is going. Imagine a world with 2 entities. Is one of them a necessary entity? If so, then we found the necessary substance in this world. If they are both contingent, then what are they contingent on? If the first is contingent on the second, then what is the second one contingent on? It can't be contingent on itself, for the reason we gave above, and it can't be contingent on the first one because that one is contingent on it. Thus, we have the same problem as before when we only had one thing in the universe. But someone may argue, why couldn't two contingent entities be dependent on themselves? Because then they must both exist together eternally in every possible world in which one of them can exist. Because if one of them did not exist, then the other one could not exist. Thus, they end up not being contingent entities, but necessary entities. Again, we have found our necessary substance. You can add layers of complexity by imagining possible worlds with an infinitely many entities, but they are all reducible to the examples already given. Thus, a necessary entity must exist. Argument 3. The modal argument from origin. This argument is a little different from the first two. It follows from the argumentation outlined in Dr. Chad Vance's paper, Dispositional Modal Truthmakers and the Necessary Origin. Vance discusses possible worlds and argues that what makes a given state of affairs a description of a possible world of ours is something called the general overlap requirement. Vance discusses the general overlap requirement this way. A possible state of affairs, S, is possible ultimately in virtue of some actual dispositional property of some actual real object, X. That is, S is possible if and only if S is directly or ultimately the effect of some actual causal entity, X. What this means is that the fact that it's metaphysically possible for Hillary Clinton to have won the 2016 election, and therefore for us to say that we can consider a possible world where Hillary Clinton did win the election, is not grounded in some possible truth about the possible world, but a real truth about the real Hillary Clinton and the American electorate and what is possible for them. This creates a branching structure of metaphysical possibilities, looking something like this. Now keep in mind that we're talking about a countably infinite number of possible universes coming out of a countably infinite number of causal nodes, so to map them all out would be physically impossible. This is only descriptive. Now why can't there be a converging branch? Something like this. Well, the reason Vance gives is that you get a problem where a possible world of that possible world diverging before the convergence of the first possible world with the actual world would fail to meet the general overlap requirement. I would argue that this is powerful evidence for why converging worlds couldn't exist, but not the reason why. Ultimately, the reason why is that if possible worlds are possible because of the general overlap requirement, then that possible world was impossible up until the time they overlapped. But if the world is impossible at a given point in time, then it can't be a possible world of ours. So we can imagine all possible worlds as branches off a central trunk branching off at causal nodes. But that means that there must be a time before the first causal node when there are no branches. That is, when all possible worlds were exactly the same. That means the first causal node exists necessarily. Thus, whatever that first causal node represents is a necessary substance. Now, Dr. Vance argues in his paper that there is a way of escaping the conclusion of a necessary substance. He writes, namely, commitment to a necessary being is avoided if there is no first causal node. If the causal series of the actual world is beginningless, then there is no initial portion from which all possibilities share in common, since, for any initial portion of the actual world that we might propose as necessarily existing, there will always be some possible world containing yet a smaller initial overlapping portion. Thus, the number of causal nodes is not countably infinite, but uncountably infinite, extending forever backwards on an infinite timeline. However, I don't believe this works because of the general overlap requirement already discussed. If there are an uncountably infinite number of causal nodes, then at the time of any given causal node, Tn, there is a possible world branching off of our world at causal node Tn-1, which does not fulfill the general overlap theory. This means that at any time n, the general overlap theory would not hold in a universe with an uncountably infinite number of causal nodes. Thus, given our acceptance of the general overlap theory, there must be a first causal node, and therefore a necessary substance. Thanks for watching. In my next video, I will prove that this necessary substance that we've discussed is uncaused and is unique in being uncaused, and therefore it must be the uncaused cause of everything else in the universe. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, and consider donating to me on Patreon. Links are in the description. Until next time, I'm Benedict the 17th. Go with God.